The day I walked into that dinner with a folder full of documents and a calm I had spent 2 years building, I was not the same woman who used to cry in parking lots after family gatherings. I remember setting the folder on the table, right next to the crystal wine glasses and the imported cheese board my aunt had arranged to impress everyone, and watching my uncle's face shift from smug to something I had never seen on him before. Fear. Real, quiet, humiliating fear. But I am getting ahead of myself because if you want to understand that moment felt like you need to understand where I came from first, and more importantly, what they made me believe about myself for 31 years. I grew up on the outside edge of wealth. Not poverty, not comfort. The specific kind of middle class that puts you close enough to money to smell it but never close enough to touch it. My mother was the black sheep of her family, the one who had married a man her parents considered beneath them. A man who worked with his hands and called people by their first names and never once apologized for it. She was written out of the inner circle long before I was born, but she still showed up. Every Christmas. Every cousin's graduation. Every birthday dinner at the estate my grandfather had built in the 70s. She showed up because she believed in family, and she raised me to believe in it too. That belief would cost me more than I can calculate. When my mother passed away in the spring of 2011, I was 23 years old, new to the city, barely holding together a graduate school stipend and a studio apartment that smelled like someone else's. Cooking. She left me a small savings account, $11,000, and a letter that told me to keep my chin up and never let them make me feel small. I read that letter so many times the paper went soft. The them she was referring to was the family. Her family. My family. And they wasted no time. Within 6 months of my mother's funeral, my uncle Marcus, the patriarch of the family by default after my grandfather died, reached out to me for the first time in years, not to check on me, not to mourn with me. He reached out because he had a proposal. He said the family had a small business venture, a property investment group, and they were looking for someone to manage the administrative side. Someone smart, he said. Someone they could trust. Someone who understood the family's vision. I should have heard what he was not saying. I was young and grieving and desperately hungry for belonging, so I heard the word trust and I felt something warm move through my chest. I said yes. The first year, I managed files, coordinated with contractors, handled tenant communications for 3 properties. I was paid $42,000 a year, which was fair enough for an entry-level role but not fair at all given that I was doing work that required a licensed property manager and 2 support staff at minimum. I told myself I was building something, learning the business, earning my place. In year 2, they asked me to take on the accounts, invoices, vendor payments, expense reporting. I did it without asking for a raise because Marcus told me there would be a profit share arrangement at the end of the fiscal year. There was not. When I asked, he told me the business had underperformed and looked at me like I had said something embarrassing. My cousin Diane, Marcus's daughter, was brought in that same year with a title, Vice President of Acquisitions, and a salary I found out later was $110,000. She had never managed a property in her life. She had a lifestyle blog and a taste for expensive shoes. I told myself it was not personal. I told myself I was still learning. In year 3, I was handling the entire financial backend of a portfolio worth nearly $4 million. I negotiated leases. I resolved legal disputes with tenants. I drafted communications that went out under Marcus's name while he golfed and attended charity galas where people took his photo. My salary had moved to $48,000, $6,000 more over 3 years. And still no profit share. And still no title. And still, at every family gathering, I was introduced as the one who helps Marcus with paperwork. Not the one who kept his business running. Paperwork. I would stand there with a glass of sparkling water and smile and feel something die a little more inside me each time. My cousin Diane would laugh too loud at the table and say things like, "Oh, she is so efficient," like efficiency was something that should embarrass me. Marcus's wife, Claudette, once told me at a Christmas dinner in front of 6 family members that I was lucky to have people like them investing in me. Investing in me. Investing in me. I was the one keeping the lights on in their investments, and she called it charity. I remember going home that night and sitting on the edge of my bed for a long time, without turning on the lights, not crying. Just sitting, thinking. That was December of 2015. By March of 2016, I had quietly started taking night classes in real estate law. I told no one. I paid out of my own savings, which by then I had disciplined myself into building despite the salary insults. I had $17,000 set aside. Not much, but it was mine. I studied at night after 12-hour days managing their portfolio. I studied on weekends while they posted family vacation photos to places I was never invited. I studied because something had shifted in me after that Christmas dinner, and I could not shift it back. I was not angry yet, not quite. I was something quieter and more dangerous. I was paying attention. Then came April of 2017, the trigger. The moment I will never fully leave behind, no matter how much peace I have made with it. Marcus called a family meeting at the estate. I came dressed professionally, assuming it was a business discussion. Everyone was there. 12 family members seated around the long dining table my grandfather had imported from Italy. Marcus stood at the head of it. He announced that the investment group was restructuring. He said they were bringing in an outside management firm to handle the administrative and financial operations going forward. He said this with the same tone he used to order wine. Casual. Final. Then he looked at me and said they would give me 2 weeks of severance and a reference letter. 2 weeks. For 6 years of work. For building a portfolio that had tripled in value under my management. For the leases I had negotiated and the legal disputes I had resolved and the accounts I had kept clean while he took the credit at Galus and in the local newspaper profile that called him a savvy self-made entrepreneur. 2 weeks of severance and a reference letter. And then Diane leaned over to her mother and whispered something, and they both laughed quietly, and they did not bother to hide it from me. I do not remember driving home. I remember being in my apartment. I remember the sound of my own breathing. I remember thinking that I could fall apart right now. I could actually fall apart. And then I thought about my mother's letter, and I thought about the word dignity, and something in me went very, very still. I did not call anyone. I did not send an angry email. I did not post anything on social media. I got out my laptop and I started a document. I titled it simply Record. And then I began. I spent the next 3 weeks compiling everything. Every email I had ever sent or received in my work capacity. Every invoice I had processed. Every lease I had negotiated. Every communication that showed my name as the actual author of documents that had gone out under Marcus's signature. I had copies of everything because I had always been meticulous and because somewhere in the back of my mind I think I had known this day was coming. I also pulled the profit share clause. I had the original employment agreement, drafted by Marcus's own attorney, which contained language about profit participation tied to portfolio growth milestones. The portfolio had hit every single milestone. I had the numbers. I had the dates. I had the documentation. I then contacted a labor attorney on a Friday afternoon, a woman named Patricia who came recommended through a legal aid network connected to my night school program. I met with her on a Saturday morning over coffee and I laid out everything calmly, and she looked at me with an expression that was half respect and half controlled outrage, and she said, "This is a very clear case." I nodded. I said, "I know. I want to do this right." We spent the next 4 months building everything properly. Patricia filed a formal demand letter citing breach of contract for the unpaid profit share, unjust enrichment, and wage theft, based on the scope of work I had performed beyond my stated role without compensation. The total demand figure, based on documented portfolio performance, unpaid profit share, and the market rate for the actual services I had rendered over 6 years, came to $314,000. While that process moved quietly through legal channels, I was not idle. I had already enrolled in a formal real estate licensing program. I had used connections I had made over 6 years of actual industry work to begin building my own client base quietly. I had 2 investors willing to work with me by the time the legal demand landed on Marcus's attorney's desk. The call from Marcus came on a Tuesday. He did not open with an apology. He opened with the word lawsuit said like an accusation, like I was the one who had done something wrong. I let him finish. Then I said, in the calmest voice I have ever used in my life, "You should speak with your attorney." And I hung up. The dinner I told you about at the beginning. The folder on the table next to the crystal glasses. That came 8 months later. The legal settlement had been reached privately. Marcus had agreed to pay $280,000 to avoid litigation and the public documentation that would have accompanied it. But the dinner was not about the settlement. The dinner was my Eleanor's birthday, and I had been invited, which surprised me until I realized Marcus had assumed I would use the occasion to be gracious, to signal that things were settled and forgiven, and return to the quiet arrangement where they occupied the top of the hierarchy, and I occupied the corner. Instead, I arrived with the folder, not the legal documents, something else. I had recently closed my first independent property deal, a 3-unit building I had purchased using a combination of the settlement, my personal savings, and a small investor partnership. It was not a large deal, but it was mine. And I had a second deal already under letter of intent. I sat down at the table and I waited for the dinner to settle into its rhythm, for the wine to be poured and the pleasantries to soften everyone's edges. And then Marcus made a comment about how it was nice that everything had worked out and that he hoped I was finding my footing in the market. He said it with that particular smile he had, the one that was meant to remind you of the distance between you. I opened the folder and I slid 2 documents across the table. One was a summary of my current portfolio. One was a projection for the next 18 months based on deals already in motion. I said nothing. I let them read. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence I had never heard at that table before. Diane stopped cutting her food. Claudette looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the documents for a long time and then he looked at me and I looked back at him with a face that gave him nothing, because I had practiced that face. I had practiced it in the mirror for months, not the face of anger, not the face of triumph, just the face of a woman who no longer needed anything from the people in this room. I left before dessert. The consequences unfolded over the following year in ways I had not fully predicted. The legal settlement had cost Marcus more than money. His outside management firm had done due diligence and discovered during the transition that several financial records contained discrepancies, not involving me, involving decisions made during the years before my tenure began. An inquiry was opened. I was not involved. I did not need to be. The reputation damage was self-inflicted and slow and thorough, the way those things usually are when the foundation has always been performance over substance. Diane's vice president title quietly disappeared from her social media profiles. Claudette stopped attending the charity galas that had been the centerpiece of her social identity. I heard from a cousin on my mother's side, one of the few who had always been kind to me, that family dinners had become tense, that Marcus had lost 2 business partners, that the estate was being refinanced. I did not celebrate this. I want to be honest about that. There was no moment where I felt joy at their difficulty. What I felt was something much simpler. I felt release. Today I manage a portfolio of 11 properties. My company has 4 full-time employees. Last year my revenue crossed the number. I will not say because it is not about the number. It is about the fact that I built it on my own terms, with my own name on every document, with full credit for every decision made. I am not angry anymore. Anger is expensive and I have more valuable things to spend my energy on. What I carry with me is clarity. The clarity that no one gets to define your value, not your family, not your title, not the salary someone offers you when they have decided in advance what they think you are worth. The moment you stop waiting for their validation and start building your own proof is the moment everything changes. My mother told me not to let them make me feel small. It took me longer than it should have to understand that the only person who could actually prevent that was me. If your family sees your potential and treats it like a threat, that is information. If the people who claim to love you diminish you quietly in front of others and call it humor, that is information. If you have been giving everything and receiving just enough to keep you dependent, that is information. Use it, not for revenge, for navigation. Build so quietly, they cannot find a way to diminish what you are building. Let the results speak in rooms where your voice was always interrupted. Then sit across the table from the people who underestimated you and give them nothing but the calm face of a woman who no longer needs their approval to know exactly what she is worth. If my story moved something in you, if it gave you permission to stop shrinking, please like this video and subscribe. I will be here and so will you, and that is enough.